And again, we're in touch. We have close contact with our counterparts in the embassy at the government of Ecuador as well. So all of these pieces we take into account as we're looking to move forward and to ensure that there is an economic benefit for Canada as we commence the negotiations and continue on with those negotiations. So those are pieces of the puzzle. Absolutely.
Okay. 20 seconds left.
Je vais me reprendre au prochain tour.
Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here again. It's good to see you once again. I think I was going to ask that previous question that Mr. Savard Tremblay asked, but I'm going to jump in to a discussion of ISDS. And, you know, after the completion of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement in 2018, sorry, I've lost my screen here. Okay. Minister Freeland, who was then Minister of International Trade, among other things, said she was very proud of the fact that we didn't include ISDS in CUSMA. Said ISDS elevates, this is a quote from her, ISDS elevates the rights of corporations over those of sovereign governments. In removing it, we have strengthened our government's right to regulate in the public interest, to protect public health and the environment. And we've had a number of cases in Canada that have been very expensive to Canadians, and we've had a number of cases in foreign countries, you know, in the guise of protecting Canadian investments. And as was mentioned, Ecuador, in the face of one of those, actually pulled out of its agreements because it didn't like what it was seeing, the effect that foreign governments could have on environmental and human rights legislation and work in Ecuador. And now we have a different government. I'm just wondering why Canada has seemingly changed its mind on ISDS. The world seems to be going away from it, Europe, but we seem to be doubling down on it, especially in cases where we have the Canadian mining industry and some players in that. Well, I'll just leave it at that. I won't go into any details, but why are we so keen on it still in this day when there seems to be a movement away from it elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll come back a little bit to some of the reasons I stated earlier in terms of why we use the investor-state dispute settlement. Just in the case, but to bring it back to Ecuador first and foremost, as you mentioned, and was mentioned at the outset, we did have a foreign investment protection agreement that was terminated in 2018. So the current status is that if an investment was made, I think more or less before May 2018, those investments are protected up until 2033. There's a clause in that foreign investment protection agreement, which is quite common, and that's how that works. So in other words, if a Canadian investor were to make an investment pursuant to a future free trade agreement with Ecuador that includes investment chapter, including ISDS, until that happens, they would not have that type of protection. Nor would they have the ability to use ISDS. So there's an important element to that.
Can I just jump in? And you know, we hear that the new ISDS, ISDS 2.0 has protections in it that say this doesn't prevent either of the parties from legislating protections for human rights or the environment. We have a situation in Ecuador, the Loma Larga mega mining project owned by Dundee Precious Metals, almost 8,000 hectares of paramo. We've had 2 binding referendums of Ecuadorian citizens that have come out with more than 80% in favor of stopping these mining projects because they're affecting the water supply for Cuenca, 600,000 people. And yet the Ecuadorian government and the company insist on advancing the project in violation of the rights to political participation. I guess I'm skeptical that this new, if a new Ecuadorian government came in and said, sorry, Dundee, you can't go ahead. We've had these referenda and we are, pulling the rights to mine here. Would that protect the Ecuadorian people, or would those go ahead? Because it seems that other situations have arisen where this doesn't really protect those governments from legislating about human rights or the environment.
Thank you for the question. So I think a few points. One is, in this situation that we're in, we've heard from Ecuador that they're interested in discussing an investment chapter with us. In our discussions, we've sent a model to them that includes investor-state dispute settlement. They're very aware of that. At the outset, you will have heard that Canada, if I'm not mistaken, is Ecuador's #1 investor. So there's mutual interest there in terms of an investment chapter with investment protection. But we have a different model, a very different model from what existed in the 1997 FIPA. We created a new model, a foreign investment protection agreement that came in that was made publicly available, I think, in 2021. It's a very different model. It builds on more than 30 years of our experience, both in receiving claims, for example, under the NAFTA, and also further investment agreements and investment chapters with partners like the European Union. So it's a chapter that has, I think, the right balance of the right to regulate on one hand and to protect things like human rights, environment, et cetera, and the ability to protect those things, while at the same time providing for investors.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martel, please, for 5 minutes.
5 minutes, hein?
5 minutes. Might stretch it a little bit.
Oui, OK. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci d'être avec nous cet après-midi. Je ne sais pas qui peut me répondre, mais je voudrais savoir, selon vous, là, c'est quoi les avantages d'entamer des négociations d'échange commercial avec l'Équateur, tandis que le Canada est déjà en négociation avec le Royaume-Uni, l'Indonésie, la NAS et l'Inde? Comment cet accord-là peut se distinguer des autres? Il y en a plus que les...
Wrong channel. Okay, can we try that again? Okay, we're gonna just a second. We're gonna start again, Mr. Martel.
Moi, j'aimerais ça savoir.
Reprendre. I would like to know what are the advantages of having negotiations and how this agreement be distinguished from the others. If I understood your question,
from an overall trade negotiations perspective, I think
d'une perspective de...
we definitely have a good base of knowledge from which we work. We have our negotiators get experience through the various negotiations, whether that's the UK, whether that's India, whether that is Indonesia and ASEAN. And that helps us build our positions as we move forward. What we'd like to do during the negotiations is to, if we get an outcome, a negotiated outcome in one agreement that is favorable to Canada, whether it's in, doesn't matter what the issue area is, but then we like to build on that and build on that experience and use it in to the greatest extent possible with the next negotiating partner. So I think in this one, some of the areas that we have negotiated with, not so much with the UK, but maybe with some of the smaller partners, I think will benefit our negotiating experience, and we look to make some of those similar type arrangements in the Canada-Ecuador FTA negotiations.
Merci. Vous avez dit que ça serait
Thank you. You said it would be economically advantageous, that agreement. Could you tell me in what way, what will be the economic impact overall to be expected from a free trade agreement with Ecuador? Thank you for the question. As I mentioned during my
opening statement, I think that there will be some economic benefits in the FTA. They're small. There's no question that Ecuador-Canada trade right now, it's not huge, but at the same time, it will generate, or our chief economist office estimates that there will be positive economic benefits in the amount of, as I said, GDP could increase by about $83 million for Canada by 2030, and Ecuador could increase by about almost $50 million over the same time frame. So not huge, but when you think about how much trade is happening this year, $1.3 billion bilateral trade, but growing, right? I mean, the objective here is really about trade diversification and finding new partners. And I think, like I said, Ecuador does provide that for Canadian producers and exporters.
With a tense political climate in Ecuador, do you think that could cause a problem?
Again, thank you for the question. I think it would be helpful to hear from our ambassador on that particular point. But what we have noted during the preliminary discussions with Ecuador is a very willing government, a very willing partner to engage in the negotiations, to engage in the negotiations that we would look at, whether that's on the goods side, services, investment, environment, financial services, all of the areas that we traditionally would put in an FTA. I think that is what we're seeing from Ecuador, and that's from both levels of government. They recently had an election, and that even with the new government in place, there is an openness on the economic front to move forward with the agenda, and I think that their economic agenda matches well with Canada's on that front. So, and I would probably at this point I would turn to the ambassador, but because he's not available, I would save that for next time.
Okay, you have 15 seconds remaining. Okay, thank you. Mr. Sheehan, please.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. And you'd mentioned that Ecuador was one of the only countries that we didn't have a free trade agreement on a Pacific South Coast. So I would imagine it would be Panama, Peru, Chile, Ecuador. Any others?
Mexico, Colombia, and Mexico.
Yeah, and Mexico.
Yeah.
So what are the advantages then? Like you said that the unilateral trade deal between Canada and Ecuador would bring modest increases, but what about the multiplier effect of then a company from Canada or whatever being able to look at that whole area? Maybe you can make some comments about that.
Thank you very much for the question. No, certainly that's an excellent point, and I would especially